such a warm welcoming. Thank you guys. So as mentioned, I was here about a year and a half ago talking about FireSmart, our program in Penticton. With a little more interest from what's going on, I'm going to delve into landscaping for FireSmart specifically. So before we get going, my name is Miyoko. I work at the Penticton Fire Department as the FireSmart Coordinator. Coming out of university, I didn't want a quote-unquote real job. So I hopped on with BC Wildfire as a dispatcher, hated sitting at a desk, so I ended up working in Penticton here as an initial attack firefighter. Did that for a few years. My partner still does it as well, and we realized that both of us doing that could not sustain a family or even really a house or a garden. So I ended up leaving and doing this job now, and I've been in it for almost 2 full years. So that's a little about me. What we're going to get into today is wildfires and specifically the wildland-urban interface, the role of FireSmart landscaping specifically, and then we'll talk a little bit about the different resources that are available to you guys, and then also we'll do a little Q&A at the end. So just a quick history of wildfires in BC. If you were residing in the Okanagan, I'm sure you will recall 2003. We had our first record-breaking year. So 265,000 hectares were burnt with just over 2,000 fires that started. After the 2003 year, we had a couple of quiet years, and then we had 2017, 2018, which were notably huge years for BC Wildfire for residents of BC. In 2017, we had 1.22 million hectares burnt and 1,300 fires that started. And then 2018, another record-breaking year with 1.34 million hectares burnt and just over 2,000 fires that started. So in 2019, 2022, we had some quieter years. 2021 was a super interesting year after 2 years of below average fire activity. As you all recall and can still remember, it was the start or the lingering of COVID-19. So having COVID-19 caused a lot of issues for us as BC Wildfire firefighters. There's a lot of issues trying to get resources cross-border, bring in people from the United States or Mexico to help us with fighting fires, but also there were other fires happening across Canada and down western United States. So we were all fighting for our resources with all these fires going on. There was also the notable heat dome that happened in 2021. So there was a drying and curing of fuels super early on in the season. And as we all unfortunately remember, Lytton did happen in 2021 as well, with record-breaking temperatures in Lytton over 40 degrees Celsius. Now this graph here is just looking at the 20-year average of number of fires that started and then how many hectares burnt. So over the 20-year trend, we're actually seeing less fires start, but we're seeing more land burnt. And we're calling these mega fires. So the reason for these mega fires are actually due to fire suppression and Colonial Act burning actually being banned. So with fire suppression, when fires are starting around BC Wildfire does a really good job of getting out there and putting the fires out really quick. We are starting to learn that's not always necessary, and maybe we should let these fires go because they are part of our ecosystem. And then with the Colonial Act banning of cultural burning, we just removed the ability to use fire respectfully on our landscapes. So between fire suppression and Colonial Act banning, we've removed fire completely from the landscape, having a lot of fuel loading, and now we're having these mega fires, even though less fires are starting. Now this here, a lot of numbers to look at, so don't be overwhelmed. What we're looking at here is the total numbers of fires that actually started, so the numbers highlighted at the bottom, compared to how many evacuation orders and alerts we're actually having due to these fires. And what we want to take from all these numbers is that it's not necessarily about how many fires are starting, it's about where they're starting and how they're impacting our communities. So as you can see, in 2018, we had just over 2,000 fires start, but we actually didn't have that many evacuation orders or alerts, compared to 2021 when we had under 2,000 fires that started. Oh, there we go, we're back. Just under 2,000 or closer to 1,500, but we had 181 evacuation orders and 300 evacuation alerts. So these fires probably happened or did happen closer to communities, prompting these evacuation orders and alerts. Something interesting from one of my favorite researchers for wildfire, his name is Jack Cohen. He says homes are just trees that have been logged, processed, reconfigured, and covered in gasoline. Trees burn well, but homes burn better. So this is where we need to start thinking about FireSmart and how where fires are starting are impacting our communities. Just a quick map here showing that wildfires truly are a provincial-wide phenomenon. Living in the Okanagan, sometimes we feel like we're at the broad end of everything, but this map is from 2018 showing fire perimeters, and you can see that it is completely spread out across the province. So wildfires and the WUI. I already said what the WUI is, so I was going to quiz you guys, but this is our wildland-urban interface, and it is where the community meets the forested areas. We have two different types of the wildland-urban interface. There's our intermix and our interface. For intermix, if you think about Spiller Road up behind the dump, the houses are kind of plotted amongst the forest, compared to our interface where there's a hard stop of the forest and then the beginning of the community. You can think of Evergreen Drive up in Wiltsey is kind of more similar to this. Both these areas in the wildland-urban interface are important areas to focus on when we're thinking about fire-smarting our communities. So BC is experiencing a serious and sustained increase in extreme wildfire behavior in the WUI. This is due to climate change, urban sprawl, so us developing farther and farther into forested areas, and then again fuel loading in the forest, which is due to poor land management and fire suppression, so taking away that fire that we'd used on the landscape. This picture here is a great visual to show how fire did transition into this community. So we have a couple houses near the bottom that are completely burnt and gone, and it looks like the trees around them are actually singed and burnt due to the ignition of that home, and the same thing happening up at the top. So it's not that the whole forest was on fire and came rolling down the hill and took away those homes. There is a reason that those homes burnt down compared to the other ones, and we'll get into that in a little bit as well. Previous WUI disasters, so we had Fort McMurray in 2016, 2,400 homes lost and $3.6 billion in loss, and that number is growing and growing just due to the economic impact it had on Fort McMurray. We also had Slave Lake in 2011, 354 homes lost with $800 million in loss. And then 2021, we had 567 structures lost, and the numbers still not to be determined, just with insurance claims and everything else. The interesting part about Fort Mac, when they went back and did some studies, is that 81% of the surviving homes were actually deemed FireSmart. So whether or not that was intentional of the homeowners that they had FireSmarted their home, the ones that were surviving were FireSmart. So looking at the WUI disaster sequence and how we end up with disaster like we've seen in Fort Mac and Slave Lake, the first thing that happens is we have severe fire conditions, so the fuel, weather, and topography are primed and ready for wildland fire. When we get that wildland fire that starts due to the severe fire conditions, there's rapid fire spread and or high intensity, and then this wildfire transitions into urban fire. So we have multiple ignitions of different structures. With these multiple ignitions, we very quickly have overwhelmed fire suppression, so we have too much fire and too few resources. In the City of Penticton, we have 2 fire halls that are staffed with 3 to 4 people at each hall, so at any given time there's 6 to 8 people on shift. Quick question for you guys, how many structure fires do you think they can tend to in the city at one time? 2, if we're lucky. With the amount of resources it takes to fight a fire, you're lucky if you can get, 2. So if you have multiple ignitions happening due to a wildfire, you're hooped pretty quick. And then obviously reduced fire protection, so we have lack of resources, which reduce effectiveness, and then disaster, so we lose many homes. When looking at this whole disaster sequence, we can't control the severe fire conditions, we can't control weather, fuel, and topography. We can't control wildland fires starting, but what we can control is the urban fire and preventing fire from getting into our neighborhoods. And that's really where FireSmart comes to play. So quickly looking at how buildings are actually ignited. We have our convective heat, was just a fancy way of saying direct flame contact, and then radiant heat, so there's enough extreme heat that it can actually ignite vegetation or structure nearby without direct flame contact. And this can obviously happen vegetation to structure or structure to structure. So in this photo here, you can tell there's not a lot of vegetation in between the homes, so it probably looks like that had gone through structure to structure, but had initiated with vegetation to structure. Now I have a quick video. And this video here is from Fort McMurray. There was a fellow that was evacuating and happened to have a dash cam, and it ended up recording all of his evacuation. So this shows them going out on their one main road and the large fire coming in there. Yeah. So when you're watching this video, you can see the forest stand there on the left, a big green open field, 2 lanes of traffic, and then some garden space on the other side. So visually, it looks like a pretty big gap to prevent a wildfire from affecting any of the buildings on the right. But we'll start to see what happens here as this fire gets going. And if you can start to see on the back of the truck cover, you'll start to see little flickers of light that are actually embers landing on the back of the truck on fire still. So now the fire is really starting to pick up. And you'll see how the radiant heat, the distance the radiant heat can cover, because this motorcyclist here will really start to feel the heat pretty quick. And in terms of wildland firefighting, these look like pretty lucky conditions. There's not a lot of wind. We don't see a lot of the fire bending over. So right here, a lot of radiant heat. And if you watch the right-hand side of your screen, you'll start to see little embers pop into people's gardens and start little fires on the right. So we've got one starting there behind the bus stop. And in the video that's playing through the laptop, you can hear the fire department coming. They surely see that fire, but they've got other tasks. And then you can see all the embers all over the road. We've got another fire starting in someone's yard right there. And this is also a neat visual. The forest fire itself has basically come and gone. It's sat down, it's not burning as aggressively anymore, but now we've got multiple ignitions happening into the community that you can see happening on the right-hand side of the screen. So we talked about the convective heat and the radiant heat, and then we just watched the video there of the embers. And it's been noted in BC that those embers can travel up to 2 kilometers given the right conditions and stay ignited. So I'm sure living in town, we've seen ash landing on our properties from nearby fires, but actual ignited embers can travel up to 2 kilometers and land on other combustible items in the garden or around the home. So that first fire that we saw there, or the second one that started, an ember blew over, landed in some bark mulch, which ignited the bark mulch, then ignited the Miyoko pine, which then led to the carport, which ultimately burnt the whole house down. So this is just one example happening in the community, and it was happening blocks and blocks into Fort McMurray. So we have the role of FireSmart. It's truly about living with wildfire and managing it on our landscapes. We don't need to get into the details of this, but just know that there's been lots of research post and pre-wildfires. There's been lots of laboratory research, so setting up different scenarios. But the methods have been or have demonstrated time and time again to reduce the risk of losses under even the most extreme fire conditions. So again, using Fort Mac as an example, had we not chosen the landscaping that they did in front of their house, if they had chosen the proper plants that wouldn't have ignited due to those embers, we might have had a different story at the end of the day for Fort Mac. So the 7 disciplines of FireSmart, this is really what drives my job every day. Just know that today we're going to be talking about vegetation management, and that's also the education piece. But there's a lot of other stuff going on. So we also have emergency planning, cross-training, and interagency cooperation. So we're really trying to promote collaboration across all government departments. Plus the fire department's trying to work with BC Wildfire to be able to deal with fires and understand how each other deals with those fires. We have development considerations and legislation planning. So legislation planning focuses a bit more on forestry management practices, and then development considerations are a little behind the 8 ball, but they are coming. In the City of Penticton right now, I'm trying to work with the planning department to have a building development permit for new builds and subdivisions in the wildland urban interface so that they are built and landscaped to be FireSmart from day one. So we're not coming back 10 years down the road, 5 years down the road, and trying to retroactively replace all the things that aren't considered FireSmart. So when we're looking at the home ignition zone, the structure and priority zones, it's really, the ignition potential is determined by the characteristics of the structure, so what it's built out of, and then the surrounding flammable materials and vegetation. So this photo here is actually from Penticton up behind Sage Mesa. There was a grass fire that ran up the hill through the grass and the sage and came up to this property. Luckily, this guy has done, or gal has done a really good job using FireSmart landscaping. So they've used landscaping rock and a whole bunch of deciduous plants. We'll get into the detail of that as well, where it actually allowed the fire department and BC Wildfire to come onto this property and defend the property from that protected area. So a great example of still having a beautiful garden, but being FireSmart and helping the department and BC Wildfire. So FireSmart landscaping, we're going to go into the who, what, where, when, why, and how of it all, starting with the what. So what is FireSmart landscaping? Based on the 7 disciplines of FireSmart, it is the vegetation management piece. Some of you might have grabbed on your way in the guide that we have that FireSmart BC made. It's a great landscaping guide. There's also a digital version available online where you can select your hardiness zone and it will populate a list of shrubs, trees, flowers that are FireSmart for your hardiness zone. I'm also trying to work with parks in town to create a landscaping guide that's specific to Penticton. So a little more water smart and potentially deer smart because the deer eat everything in this town. But also be FireSmart. And then when you're out shopping around town, there's also something called the FireSmart plant tagging program. Home Hardware, Garden Works, and Flowers on the Bench are all on board with this, and they just tag plants that are FireSmart. So while you're out shopping, you just have to look for that tag, and you'll know that it's FireSmart. So who is affected? Everyone's affected by wildfire. I'm sure we all know someone, or we are someone that has been evacuated or been affected by a wildfire. This photo here was a fire in 2021 in Kamloops, and it started on a hillside between 2 separate neighborhoods. Luckily with the weather, we didn't have terrible wind conditions, and it was also nighttime. They were able to deal with this fire without losing any homes, but had it been midday with a little bit of a wind going uphill, it could have been a very different story. When? So obviously you don't want to try and FireSmart when the wildfire is at your doorstep. We want to start focusing about it before it gets there, and we don't want to have the mindset that it's not going to happen to me. So spring is just around the corner. It's a great time to start thinking about gardening, and it's a great opportunity to plant FireSmart instead of not FireSmart. And then where? So where should you focus your FireSmart landscaping? I definitely say the main focus would be to focus in the non-combustible zone, which is the immediate 1.5 meters around the home, and then that 10 meters as well. Science and studies have shown that having that area treated to a FireSmart standard really has a big impact on preventing wildfire from reaching your home. When the White Rock Fire on West Side Road happened a couple years ago, everyone was evacuated and we were brought in as strike teams, and we would just pull anything combustible away from the house and pile it away from the house. Fire came through, we went back to help clean up. Those piles we made were burnt and gone, but the house was still standing. So all those combustible items that we pulled away, had they been up against the house, there's a potential it could have led to the ignition of the house. And why? We live in a wildfire-prone area with climate change and everything else going on. We're definitely going to have to learn to live with wildfire rather than trying to fend it off. And then how? It's tough. There's lots of different messages out there that you're trying to plant for. You want to have your pollinators. You want to plant for birds and wildlife. You want to plant native plants. We're thinking water smart, and then now we're thinking fire smart. It can be overwhelming, but don't try and plant for just one. Try and consider all of these different things. And this is kind of what I'm aiming for when we're going to put out our Penticton specific FireSmart landscaping, is that it will hit all these bullets. And one thing to remember, it's xeriscape, it's not xeroscape. I think a lot of people think that FireSmart landscaping should look like this, and I completely disagree. It doesn't just need to be a concrete, barren land. There's definitely a way that you can have a beautiful garden that's still FireSmart and resilient to wildfire. So what is xeriscaping? It's water conservation through creative landscaping, and it's pronounced xeriscape, not xeroscape. It's planning and design using good soils and appropriate plant selection. It can be lush and green and as a conventional landscape, and allows for the creation of any style or image desired. So if you want a Mediterranean style garden or a Japanese style garden, you just have to think about the 7 principles and use it for that garden, and then put FireSmart in there as well. So there's no specific look when it comes to xeriscaping, and it's definitely not that. So making the connection, we have our FireSmart message, which is the dry combustible landscape materials in close proximity to a resident increase risk of home ignition. And then we have the WaterSmart message, which is lush green landscapes and are discouraged in areas where water usage is a concern. So, however, even in the driest regions, it is possible to conserve water and have an attractive FireSmart landscape. And a good example was that one I showed here in town. But there's another good example. So FireSmart and xeriscape, they've used nice green plants. The only change I would make is to remove the one coniferous pine there. But if there is a discontinuation of combustible fuels to the home, I could probably say you could leave that, but I need to see a better picture. But I still think that that's a beautiful garden. There's different opportunities to still have a beautiful garden without completely getting rid of all your plants. So design considerations, you want to minimize ladder fuels. So ladder fuels are anything low to the ground that would allow fire to get up into trees. You want to use decorative rock and pathways and retaining walls where possible. Design ponds and streams. Make choices that meet your gardening time constraints as well. So you want to be able to maintain your garden. And then plant and maintain a healthy lawn as well. So a green healthy lawn can actually act as an effective fuel break. And we'll often see on wildfires where it comes to a green patch and it just doesn't burn through that area. And speaking of lawns, you can actually use clover in your lawns. It keeps a green lawn and it uses a lot less watering. So this was actually in Kamloops. It was a trial project to see how clover would react through the summer. Stayed super green through the summer, needed a lot less water. Last summer, I actually just overseeded my yard with clover, stayed far more green, less water, and my dog pee didn't burn the grass. So another good plus. But it's an awesome look when it actually does grow through like that, and it does create quite a full looking lawn. So plant selection, what you're going to consider, you need to think about your hardiness zone, what the mature size of the plant is going to be, the location of the plant, the maintenance it requires, the water it requires, how much sun or shade it needs, and then also wind. For healthy ecosystems, we want to consider our pollinators, our native plants. We don't want to have invasive plants. Consider the birds and the wildlife, so around here definitely the deer, and then just creating healthy landscapes in general. So looking at plant selection, we want to have those fire-resistant plants, and the characteristics of those are moist, supple leaves. They have little dead wood or material within the plant. There's water-like sap with little to no odor and low amounts of sap or resins. And then we want to stay away from those highly flammable plants, which really are our coniferous trees, so our cedars, our junipers, our pines. They get a lot of buildup of fine, dry, dead material within the plant that definitely helps with ignition. The plant parts contain volatile waxes and resins, and that's actually what helps keep these evergreens green. But those resins are highly volatile as well. They generally have leaves that are aromatic because of those resins. And then they have low amounts of sap or resins, and then loose and papery bark. So that bark is also very easy to ignite. When we're looking at plant selection based off of our leaf types, we always say yes to our deciduous. They're great FireSmart plants, they just don't ignite the same. To explain or try and give a visual to it, when you're having a campfire, we generally use cedar. It burns really well, it burns really hot. And if you were to take a maple branch and try and throw it in there, probably wouldn't ignite the same. So we want to stay away from those coniferous. And then for broadleaf evergreen, it depends on the species. So you'd have to use the landscaping guide just to make sure. For example, rhododendron is a broadleaf evergreen. It's completely FireSmart, but holly wouldn't be, just due to those resins that exist in holly. Now, a big one we deal with in and around town is for plant selection is screening and privacy. So people use all these coniferous shrubs to create basically a fence for a sight barrier and a sound barrier. Unfortunately, they do ignite quite aggressively, and if a cedar hedge completely lines up with your house, there's the potential it could ignite and then spread fire to the home. So some other options we're putting out there, a common one is cotoneaster. It's super beautiful through the summer, stays nice and green. Through the fall, it goes red, and in the winter, it does lose its leaves. So you have to consider the timing of when you need that privacy or sound barrier, because you do lose a bit of that privacy. Also, when you're considering or when you're planting, make sure you're considering your neighbors. So maybe the top left photo, you've planted all those along the backside of your garden as a privacy. It doesn't attach to your home. It's far enough away that if it did ignite, it wouldn't damage or ignite your home, but it's right up against your neighbor's house. Maybe think twice about it, depending on how you like your neighbors. For mulching, definitely can reduce our fire risk with mulching. We saw it in that first video where the ember landed in the mulch and then spread to the Miyoko pine. So we want to choose non-combustible mulch for areas next to the structure. You can use bark or other organic mulch away from the structure. We just don't want it right up against the structure. And then mature compost can be used near your building as well. For maintenance, we want to keep all plants healthy. Unhealthy plants definitely can ignite easier. And then we want to remove dead plant material, the whole plants or branches if that's an option. And then the pruning part, it says to remove all lower tree branches 2 meters from the ground. I say 2 meters from the ground or 1/3 of the tree, because if your tree is 2.5 meters tall and you remove 2 meters of branches, it's going to look a little silly. So use your best judgment there. But removing the lower branches is just to prevent fire from climbing up into the tree. So successful FireSmart landscaping reduces the risk of home ignition while maintaining a functional and enjoyable space. So it doesn't have to be a concrete garden that you go out and bake in when we have 35-degree weather. For FireSmart resources, there's a lot of information out there, and I could talk about FireSmart all day, but if you want to pick and choose what you're interested in, we have a great website through FireSmart BC that has lots of different resources that show you assessments, videos, photos. It has the landscaping guide on there as well. We also have a podcast that's starting to gain a little bit of momentum, talking to different people that are professionals in wildfire and FireSmart. We have all our guides, the couple that I brought there as well. And then, as I mentioned, we also have the FireSmart plant taking program. So we are in 3 different stores around Penticton. If you're aware of any other plant stores that you think would benefit from this, please let me know. It is a free program to join, so I'd be happy to connect with anyone and set up the FireSmart landscaping in their store. And then just to plug our program a little more, May 6th, 2023 this year at Rotary Park, we're going to be having a family-friendly FireSmart event. So there's going to be live music, there'll be food, and then all the right holders and stakeholders that are involved in FireSmart, so you can go around and chat to see how they play a part. Some notable ones, we're going to have some goats there that are for petting, but also fuel management. That's another piece that will be at this event, but definitely come and check it out.